Next up is Anna from Vana. Kind of rhymes. Sorry. When I saw the title of her presentation, I thought it was a very good ending to Open Source AI Summit because Illy and I were talking about user-owned AI throughout the entire preparation for the summit. And so it'd be wonderful to hear from Anna about her insights as well. But please give a big round of applause for Anna.
Is this okay? Great. Hey everyone, I'm Anna from Vana. I'll be talking today about, you can say Anna, Vana, or Anna, Vana, because it rhymes. I'll be talking about user-owned AI foundation models. Maybe like quick intro to me. So I first got into crypto through mining Ethereum back in 2015. I would go to the MIT dumpsters and find old GPUs that labs had gotten rid of and sort of start mining. And I think it was this period in crypto where everyone was really ideologically motivated, right? And everyone was sort of like, hey, let's try to build a financial system that is owned by its users rather than a few centralized entities. I think that decentralized AI and open source AI feels a lot like that today, right? It's this really early community that is very kind of ideologically mission-driven, and that's still forming around the technology, sort of figuring out how things should work. I wanted to start with actually a distinction between open source AI and user-owned AI. So centralized AI is pretty much what we all know today. You have like open AI, they keep their model weights private. And so one of the advantages of this is that it's monetizable, right? And that's important because the models are really expensive to build, right? You need a huge amount of compute, you need a huge amount of data. But the downside is that it's just controlled by one. Then you have open source AI. The advantage is that it's controlled by many, so you can download the model weights, run it on your computer, you've got full control. But one of the challenges is that it's not monetizable. And I think we've seen this a lot. There's been a shift probably in the past year or so where a lot of the big bets on open source AI have actually had a lot of trouble monetizing, right? So you invest a lot in training Stable Diffusion, you put it out there into the world, and it's actually really hard to get back the money you need to then train future versions of the model. And so user-owned AI basically is the best of both worlds, right? So you're able to monetize the model, so you can finance really capable models, but you're also able to have it controlled by many. And the key piece here is basically you need a large group of people to digitally own something that's private. So that's the real unlock between open source AI and user-owned AI. You have to keep the data or the model weights. You have to be able to exclude them, right? You can't charge someone for something if it's already open source. And so, yeah, kind of looking at foundation models, just going to pull up the slides on my computer so I can see better. Okay, so I think this was actually covered a lot in the last talk already, just how much AI models are going to play a really important role in our kind of experience of reality, our like economic reality in the future. So whoever owns and controls those models has a lot of power, right? They get to essentially decide truth, right? We saw this with the example where, did people see how Google Bard, they took it down pretty quickly, but if you asked it for a historically accurate picture of a medieval British knight, they would give you like an Indian woman or a black man. And I think it's so extreme that it's really easy to laugh about of like, oh, this is this crazy wokeness of 2023, 2024. But if we didn't have another source of truth, this could actually become our reality, right? And there would be no way to check it. So it's really important that the models, as they're our source of truth, are kind of collectively controlled by a large group of people. The other thing is just economic resources in an AI native role, right? Like OpenAI recently hit $3.4 billion in revenue, and that's just a huge amount of money to be making off of these AI models that are largely trained on many people's data. And so AI models, they're really only as good as their training data. If you post on Reddit, if you've posted before 2022, which is when WebText-2 was scraped, you've probably already helped contribute to GPT-3 and some of the other AI models. But the data that people train on today, it's mostly public data, right? And that represents a very small portion of the overall internet. So the problem we're running into now, who's read Leopold's thing on like AI? Okay. So he talks a little bit about this data wall that we're hitting. And the idea, so here are some of the recent foundation models that have been trained, and then the amount of training data in trillions of tokens. And we're basically running out of public data to train on. So FineWeb, which is a cleaner version of Common Crawl, so basically just like scrape all of the internet and then try to like dedupe it, make sure it's a little bit clean. That's basically the training data size of Llama 3. So we have run out of public data to train on. So if you want to push the capabilities of these models, then you need to find another source of data. Something I'll note here too is this is actually, in Leopold's essay, he goes into some of the details here, but in all these asymptotic graphs, or these exponential graphs people show of model capability, of like, hey, just put more compute in, and then we'll get AGI in a few years, or whatever they're predicting. One of the key assumptions is that there's enough data, and there's actually not enough public data out there right now. So people are really scrambling to figure out, hey, how do you get enough data to train these models on? And the companies that have some of the valuable data have realized this and really kind of locked it down, right? So Reddit changed their API policy and started selling their data for like $200 million. PhotoBucket can earn $1 to $2 an image. Apple's buying data for like $50 million. That's in used data to train on. And there's sort of this trend, which is like the internet is becoming less and less open. Because the companies want to build bigger walls to keep their really valuable training data in, right? And I think that it just becomes, I think in the early days of the internet, it felt much more user-owned, like you set up a site, et cetera, and now it's like you enter the walls of a big platform and they give you the rules that you play by. So one group still has access to their data, which is users. So a lot of people don't realize, but you legally own all of your data. So like your Reddit data, for example, you might think of it as Reddit's data, but it's legally yours, and you grant a very permissive license to Reddit in order to use it. If you want a fun but slightly creepy activity and you have an Alexa, you can actually ask for an export of your data and hear every single recording of you ever talking to Alexa in history. I imagine people are somewhat privacy focused, so maybe they don't have that. But another sort of exercise in seeing your data is requesting your Instagram export. Has anyone done that before? Nice. OK, cool. Well, so they actually have to give you the labels they've put on you, not just your data. So they have like 300 labels. Like one of the labels they had put on me was stressed but not depressed. It's like actually crazy, right? So like I would, recommend doing that. And it's just this reminder that the paradigm I think that big tech wants is like they own all of this data, but actually the legal grounds is that users own all of it. And that's thanks to a lot of the data regulation that exists today. So this sort of leads to this question, right? Could 100 million users export their platform data to create a user-owned foundation model? So it's always helpful to kind of consider like just back of the envelope math, right? Do they have enough data, and would it be possible? So one, users have a lot of data, so 15 trillion tokens for Llama 3, and then if you get 100 million users contributing their data across 5 platforms, you can basically get to 30 times that. And then I think with the right incentives, you can actually get even more data, right? So if you're properly incentivized and it's sort of like, hey, trade your training data in some privacy-preserving way in exchange for ownership in ChatGPT or kind of user-owned AGI, I think we're going to start to see people more actively collecting data as well. And so this is, I had to look up actually what 5,000 trillion was, but 5 quadrillion tokens is what you get to if you have 100 million users record everything they say for a few years. Obviously, there are a lot of privacy implications here, but it's kind of a good benchmark just to think about, hey, how can we get past the data wall? So the other big input for training a foundation model, it's not just the data, it's also the compute. Right? And so you can amass all of this data, but if you can't train the model, then you're not able to create that new kind of user-owned foundation model. And so one estimate I did, and I know there was earlier kind of a session on decentralized compute and kind of the business model there. I actually used to be really skeptical of like decentralized training because I thought it was like, you know how it's trained in a data center, it seems really inefficient to train it across all these different devices. But after basically sitting down and doing the math of like, how many flops did it take to train GPT-4 versus how many flops do all Ethereum miners have, they have like 50 times as many, right? So even if you take like a 10x hit in performance, you can potentially have a lot of different people all collectively contribute compute to train the model, right? So it's not just your data, it's also that you train a small piece and then merge that in. There's ongoing research here, so this is like definitely not production ready. Some of the folks doing it, like MergeKit, I would call out, they're basically building a way where you can take a 70B model and another 70B model and kind of like merge them together. They call them Franken-merges. So the sort of scaled up version of this is we all train little pieces of the model and then merge them all together. And something I'll note too, in production for Vana today, we don't have this federated training working. We're using a secure environment to train user-owned models. And so that's what's in production today. And then once you have the model, it's a question of kind of like, okay, who earns as it's used? Who gets to decide how it's used too? I think there's a lot of debate today on censorship, right? Like something I run into actually working with Claude is if I talk to it about crypto or decentralization, it will sometimes refuse to help because it will say crypto is unethical. I don't know if folks have run into that, but it's kind of surprising because I'm asking like quite reasonable things. And so, yeah, letting people decide those rules. Something I'll mention here, too, is it's sort of like how much of the model should each person own, right? So if you have 100 million people, like different people are going to contribute different amounts. And so Vana runs on this concept of proof of contribution, where basically you're measuring for a given data point, how much is this contributing to the model overall or the collective overall? And there's some interesting research there related to model influence functions. Has anyone heard of a model influence function before? Okay, a little bit. Basically, you take a trained model, and then you give it a data point, and you see how much information does the data point contain that the model doesn't already know. And so that's sort of the purest way of measuring how much someone's data is contributing to that model. You can also end up with kind of national models that better represent cultures and ideologies. So in summary, foundation models really tend towards monopolies, right? So they take huge upfront investments in the form of research, data, and compute. And I think what the open source AI community is broadly doing today is relying on hand-me-down open source models from large AI companies, right? And so we're basically like, okay, hopefully Meta continues to open source Llama 4 or Llama 5, or someone else is going to continue to do this. But I don't think that we can necessarily count on it. And I think we need to realize that actually users, if coordinated in the right way, have enough data and compute to make this possible. And so this kind of new category of user-owned AI is really pushing the frontiers of model performance by aligning incentives and putting users in control. I think sometimes when people hear the word data ownership, they might think of something that's more like anti-progress, right? Of like, oh, I don't want to use any technology, or people might associate privacy tech with that too. But actually, the bottleneck today in training these models is data, right? So if you can find a way to allow for an even bigger training data set, you can actually push performance. And so Vana is building user-owned AI through user-owned data. So our view is that data is the key piece that's needed to make user-owned AI work. There are two core concepts I'll call out with Vana. So one is called non-custodial data. So Vana lets you manage access to your data just like your funds. So you can log into an application and bring your data there with you, and you can kind of granularly permission access to your data and work with private data nicely on-chain. The other thing is proof of contribution, right? So my data on its own is not valuable, right? It's only valuable if you can pool it into what we call like these data liquidity pools, actually build up enough training data in order to train some models. And so proof of contribution is what enables these data liquidity pools. And so in terms of kind of, yeah, a lot of this has been very abstract, but kind of tying it back down to like, hey, what's out there in production today? What are people building? So one of the projects that launched on Vana is the Reddit Data DAO, which saw actually around 1 million people try to join and then 140,000 real Reddit users join. And what's cool about this is it's like, a lot of those users were actually everyday Reddit users who hadn't really interacted with crypto before, right? But the messaging of like, get paid for your data or own this model really resonated with that user base of folks who have a fair amount of karma and can contribute to the model. And so this is now the largest data DAO in history, and they're actually training a user-owned LLM. I'll call out, it's not going to be a user-owned foundation model. It's probably going to just be really good at like shitposting, right? So you'll have, the first model is a user-owned shitposting model, but then it gets better from there. And one important piece of this is kind of making the distinction between publicly scraped data and data that's fully public, and data that you can keep private so that you can monetize it, right? And so there are many ways that you could just kind of go publicly scrape all of Reddit and train a model on that. But if you have users all contribute their data and keep that private as long as the model weights are private too, then you can basically let users choose how the model gets used, earn from it, et cetera. And then, oh, maybe I'll call out too, there are 16 different slots on the network. Oh, that's here. So this is the overall kind of Vana architecture. So you have this data liquidity layer. There are 16 different data liquidity pools. You can think of these as kind of like a data DAO. If you're familiar with BitTensor's architecture and their 32 subnets, these data liquidity pools are pretty similar to a subnet. And so contributors are contributing data, and validators are checking the quality. There's actually someone in this room who's building the journal data liquidity pool, Miriam. So if you want to help with that, go say hi to her afterwards. There are also folks building the Twitter data DAO, the YouTube one. There's a ChatGPT one for synthetic data. And if you want to get involved, come find me or just visit vana.org. And then in order to connect the data from all these different data liquidity pools, there's basically this real-time map of all the data in the system. This is essentially just an on-chain record of everyone's data. And everyone stores their data actually on their own. So if you know, do people know Solid Project or Urbit, their personal server architectures? So they were really early, I think, to the space, almost too early. But what they've done a really good job at is figuring out how do you keep data under a user's full control and then still make it portable and usable across the internet? So Vana uses that same personal server architecture to keep data private while also making it portable. And then you have apps and stuff that can use the data, right? So imagine you can log into just a large language model or any application, and all of your data is there with you, right? So all of your messages, all of your journal entries, all of your tweets, you can bring that with you throughout the internet. And yeah, I guess to sum it up, I think all of us are here to build and participate in open source AI, decentralized AI. Vana is specifically focused on user-owned AI and the kind of data piece of that. But get involved, start a data DAO. Our testnet is live, and there are 16 different kind of competitive slots for data liquidity pools. There are 8 teams competing to build the Twitter data DAO. So I encourage you to choose a data source that is not Twitter. And then you can also run a validator or a propagator node. That's all I have. Thank you.